sword drills, but if you got the word, let's open up to Genesis chapter 1, and this is our second session in the book, in the first book. So as we began Genesis last time we were together, we got through the first 10 verses. Lord willing, we will get through the rest of this chapter tonight, and so we're going to see the rest of the creation story as we finish up Genesis chapter 1. So just a quick recap. There's so many angles to the creation story that we could go down. There's really a lot of different types of discussions we could have. And we broke this chapter down into 4 meaningful questions, things we can learn about ourselves and about the Lord through Genesis chapter 1 and the creation story. And last week we looked at some of those, and tonight we're going to look at 2 more. Eternal questions, big questions that everybody asks these questions. And the glorious thing is there are answers to these great big questions that everybody asks. And so tonight we'll see a couple more of those in Genesis. But just as a reminder, the book Genesis, it is named after the first couple of verses in the book, which is in the beginning. That is where we get the Greek word Genesis from. It's the beginning of everything fundamental. Everything from man to creation, everything in creation, to sin and death and redemption. Don't stop there when you start talking about humans and then sin and death, and keep going, because it also gives the plan of redemption in this book and how we can fix it all. Not that we fix it, but that he fixes it for us. So it is absolutely foundational in that way, and that's what's so critical and some people do not take the book of Genesis to that extent in the creation story, and they don't consider it absolutely fundamental to hang on to a literal interpretation of exactly what God says here. And I'm telling you, there are things in the scripture that the Lord has not made 100% clear. There are. Church government. Should you have one leader called a pastor? Should you have a board of elders? Should you have deacons? And lots of variation in so many of the things that the Lord has given us in the Word for life and godliness. But there are things that we as a church, we cannot bend. It says what it says, and if you take away the literal 6-day creation account from Genesis, you are corrupting the plain intention of what it's saying. And we can give people that ask the questions excellent reasons to believe in a 6-day creation just the way it's laid out here. And we can show them how that lines up with creation. So this book is really the beginning of everything, and I love the fact that even in the word universe, it speaks of God and his creation. Universe means single spoken sentence, and man, that is just powerful stuff. So we began chapter 1, and we saw God creating, God starting, God doing everything. We talked about how it doesn't even begin to describe where God came from, because anybody, Christian or non-Christian, would accept the fact that God, whatever that is, by definition, is the cause of everything else. And he himself was not caused by anything. That's just a definition of God. Whether you believe in a Christian God or not, that's the definition of God. Nothing caused him to be, yet he causes everything else to be. And there's no attempt at explaining himself. Just as if you wrote your autobiography, you wouldn't attempt to describe that you are. Because by nature of you writing it, you are. If there is a design, there's a designer. If there's a painting, there's a painter. If there's a you, there's a God. And that's the idea behind him not even attempting to describe himself. So as we begin this book, it's truly a love letter of God taking time to explain himself to us. And we see these 4 big questions that are answered for us from God in this chapter. And the first question we looked at last time was the question of who is God? And we begin to get an answer right in the opening verses of the book. And we can't recap everything we went through in the first 10 verses of chapter 1. But the bottom line is God describes himself as the I am that I am. He's the eternal one who always has been. He has the power to sustain all things. And he's a God that's completely satisfied within himself. That's who he is. And it's laid out in these first verses, in the definition of the word God, in how God acts, that this is who he is. He's beyond time. He's eternal. and yet he sustains and creates all things. And then the second big question that we tackled in the first couple of verses of Genesis chapter 1 is the idea of if God cares for us. Yes, okay, so he's big and he's eternal and he's huge, but does he care for me? Am I important? Or is it just that he's huge and powerful? No. We looked at that last week and we saw how God's activity in creation, his intricate involvement with everything, speaks to the idea that he cares about everything that he does. He wants to be involved with every step of it. And so God would say that he is personally guiding and taking care of us. He provided an eyewitness account through Moses writing this to tell us exactly how it happened, so we wouldn't have to be left wondering about what happened in creation and how God began it all. And so today we're going to pick up in verse 11. We've gotten through the first couple of days of creation. And so let's just keep going. We're going to pick up in verse 11. And let's see what God has to say as we get on to some more of day 3 of creation. Okay? So, Revelation. Genesis chapter 1, verse 11. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth," and it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. All right, so continuing on the third day of creation here in these verses, this is now vegetation coming from the earth. Now, people have already, we're going to get to the idea of no sun yet, because the sun's not been created. So people have struggled with that and said, well, if there's no sun, then how could the vegetation have survived? We're going to get to that in a couple of verses, so hang on to those thoughts. But what I want to focus in on right now is the idea that on day 3, he creates vegetation, and he creates, we're going to see more later on, that uses this phrase that's used here, which is after their kind. So each type produces after their kind. This is a continual theme that's used throughout the creation week here, that the things that he creates are made after their kind. This is really, it's the same idea as what we'd see in science. Science lays it out in lots of different layers of organisms, right? So, I mean, you could go the whole way down to talking about everything, animals. We talk about the animal kingdom. That's all the animals together. You put all of life together and you've got a domain, and then you break things down from class to order to family to genus to species, right down to the individual item or biology that you're talking about, right? And so species and genus is what I just want to look at, because one of the important things here to recognize is that God created after their kind. Specifically here, it's talking about vegetation. A biblical kind, using the language that's here, speaks basically to the idea of species. Now, I don't know if I have too many pictures here coming up, but a species is basically 2 different dogs, for example. 2 different dogs. Have you ever seen 2 different types of dogs be able to breed together? Yes, that happens. That would be an example of 2 different species of dogs breeding together, and that can happen. But have you ever seen a dog and a cat breeding together? No, it doesn't happen. A dog would be one type of genus, and a cat would be another type of genus. It doesn't happen. And the reason I bring this up, and it works the same way in vegetation, which is specifically what we're talking about here, vegetation produces after its kind. There's got to be somebody with a green thumb here tonight that recognizes that vegetation, not all vegetation can interbreed with each other. Some vegetation have helicopters on pine cones, right? And yet other ones are, have you ever seen anything sticky that latches onto your pants and then it's carried away, Some vegetation, their seeds are sticky, some are prickly, some are helicopters to float away. There's lots of different types of seeds and the way they reproduce. So not even just within the seed, but the method of the reproduction is all different because they all have their own methods after their kinds. And they can't intermix. We can at the species level, but you can't any higher. And this is what I find fascinating, because all day long you're going to see evolutionists take the idea of how one dog can breed with another dog, and they're going to say that's an example of evolution, and it's not. You can use the word microevolution to describe that, and that's just fine, but that's not necessarily the best term to put to it. It can just be variations, a variation within a kind. That happens all day long. But as an example, it has its limits, okay? Anybody have any idea how much money there is in horse racing? There's a lot of money in horse racing. If they could breed a horse with a bird, they probably would. Put wings on that thing and we'll win the race, all right? So there's limits to the variation that you can do. The point is, you cannot breed outside of the species, and you can even breed only to a certain extent, and you can't go any farther. Law of diminishing returns. You can only get so much of the characteristic that you're looking for, and then there's an end to it. So very important to recognize that even in creation, here with vegetation, and later God makes a big point to say that it's done, it's created, it reproduces after their kind. It's important to recognize that. So if an evolutionist tries to say that an example of one type of dog breeding with another type of dog is evolution, you could say, no, that is just a variation within a species. That is not an example of evolution, of one type of thing, or one genus, or one kingdom, or class, or anything else breeding with another. It doesn't happen. There's no examples of such a thing. Okay? So, as we get into the rest of these verses coming up, the whole principle that we're trying to raise right now is the idea that God has put a lot of time and specific care, delicate balance, ordered, structuredness into creation. None of this is willy-nilly. There is a lot of plan and care to this. And this is really the next thing that I want to talk about here, is the question of whether we can trust God. It begins to get answered right here in the creation story, with the whole idea that God has created everything in this world in a very delicately balanced system that all goes together. The ecosystem with the water systems, with the solar waves, everything in the universe goes together in a delicately balanced cycle. I think we might have given the example the last time. There was a study done in 1989 by an Ivy League school that I'm drawing a blank on right now that said that if you remove the entire bird population from South America, the entire world ecosystem collapses within 20 years because it all works off of each other. The way the water, with the air, with the birds, with all of the different kingdoms work together, they would collapse without each other. It's a delicately balanced cycle. It all functions off of each other. So, and I think we said this before, that God didn't hand baby Adam and baby Eve a pile of seeds and say, you better hurry up and eat these, you're going to get hungry tomorrow, or, plant these because you're going to get hungry tomorrow. You need food, so hurry up and get farming. Not everything in creation was at day zero of its maturity. Some things were fully mature, some things were halfway in between, some things were very immature. Everything began in a delicately balanced cycle. Does that make sense? Some things were mature, some things weren't. Okay, Adam and Eve were probably 30. Who knows? That's a guess, okay? They weren't babies. They were smart enough to obey and have a relationship with the Lord and then disobey in just a little while. So we'll get to that. I'm sure you know some of that story. One of the classic examples of this, and we're getting a little bit heady early on, and we'll get to some different things here in a little while, but one of the classic examples that evolutionists will always use is the idea of starlight. They'll say, well, the starlight takes so long to get here because of how fast light travels, we can measure that. And they say that because of how long it takes starlight to get here, when we see one burn out, we know that, that was so many billions of years ago that star had begun to burn out, and now we're just now seeing that light burn out because of how long it takes the light to travel here. They're missing this one easy fundamental principle. That the moment God created, the light wasn't at the star, and then God said, okay, light, go ahead and start emanating. The light was already halfway here, or 3/4 here, or whatever. There was already a delicate balance of everything at the time that he created it. just as we see in Adam and Eve, just as we see in the fact that they already have vegetation that's at the time of creation. So just don't fall for this idea that you need millions of years to make different things in the universe fit. You don't have to. God created it that way on the first second that it came around, okay? So all through the creation story that we've been seeing from day 1, 2, 3, we've been seeing God separating things the whole way. And it speaks to this idea that God is a God of order, planning. He's involved with this. We know what he's up to. He's explaining it to us. And it lends us to trust that he has a plan. Day 1, he separates light from darkness. Day 2, we saw that he separated the waters from above the heavens from the water that was below. Day 3, in verses 9 and 10, we saw that he separated the water from the land. Coming up in day 4, we're going to see him separate day from night. So don't miss that as part of the creation story here, is that God is separating this from that the whole way through. He's giving us just what we need and separating us from the rest. You need this, you don't need that. You need this, you don't need that. And in a lot of ways, he forces us, or he has us experience both so we know the difference. We live in the day, right? In the New Testament, doesn't Jesus say, live in the day, walk in the day. Don't be as those that walk in the night. Okay? So the point is, he gives us both. Here's day, here's night. And he wants us to be children of the day, right? Children of darkness is set aside. All of these he's constantly using as examples to say, I have separated you unto this. So all through the creation week, there's separation, there's separation, there's separation. This is already God planning exactly how he has this great life for us planned. I have these things for you. Stay away from that. But I got these things planned for you. The whole way through. Don't miss that there's this constant separation. God just constantly puts this great care and planning to give us just the environment that we need. And it's not just that he's creating one. You know, what would it be if somebody came to you and said, here is some good things? Oh, that sounds great. But what if he comes to you and says, here are some great things, and I want you to know the opposite. I want you to know how bad it would be if you didn't have this, you would actually have this. So that's what he's doing. I mean, have you ever had a parent or somebody that says, do this, and you're like, why? Why do we do that? Just do it. Okay? God doesn't do that. God says, here's this glorious thing, but I want you to understand the opposite. He doesn't want you to get into it. You don't have to experience the bad thing. Some people in the world will say that, right? You're like, oh, I got to experience drugs to really know why it's bad. Or what a stupid thought. That's 2 weeks out of 2 weeks I've said that word. I'm trying not to say that word. It's just not helpful. My point is this, is that God explains to us why something is good and then says, and this is not. Here's why. And he explains it to us. And I love that. Don't miss that. And even in creation, when you see God separate things, I don't think we naturally return blessing to God until you recognize what it would be like to not have God's blessing. Right? I mean, what if somebody came to you and said, some of you aren't driving yet, but a lot of you are. What if somebody came to you and said, listen, there was a $8,000 speeding ticket that you were supposed to get, and I just took the ticket, and I went down to the courthouse, and I paid your fine. You'd be like, well, okay. It wouldn't make sense. It kind of sounds like good news, but maybe it's bogus. But what if somebody else came up to you and said, you know what? Yesterday, you were coming home. Do you remember that yesterday when you were coming home? You were driving down Route 11. And do you remember you came through that school zone? You remember that? Oh, yeah, I remember that. Right, there's a school zone there. Well, they started school yesterday. And you might not have realized it, but they had the slow children zone signs on. They had the 15 mile an hour on. And you came blowing through there at 50 miles an hour. I know you didn't see it, but the automatic cameras, they picked it up, and they also noticed you're swerving and all these other things you did, and the ticket was coming to your house. I got the ticket. I paid the ticket for you. How would you feel then? right? The idea is that when you understand the bad news, the good news makes that much more sense. There's a lot of people today that they don't appreciate you saying, God loves you, God loves you, God loves you, because they don't understand the heap of trouble that they're in. They don't have an appreciation for the fact that our mistakes are leading us to hell until we're born again. And so there has to be a true understanding of the crime to understand the awesome blessing that God's given to us. And we see it even in creation, that God separates the day from the night, the water from the land, and says, I don't need you to be out there drowning. I'm going to put you on the dry land. I don't need you to be groping around in the darkness. I've put you in the light. And so he gives them the understanding of both right from the beginning. Everything that God has created and put around us, he's done it so that we can trust him. It's not just here's light. I'm not going to explain anything else to you. I'm not going to even explain darkness to you. It's just, here's land. I'm not going to explain that water out there to you. I'm just here's land. No, he explains things as he goes. All of it is for us to be able to trust that God has a plan. Even when God brings hard things, he does it in such a way where he explains that it's for our good. A classic example of that is in Jeremiah, when the children of Israel are being taken into Babylon. They're going to have to spend 70 years in Babylon. And he says to them, that's the context of this verse that so many people read. They're going into captivity. They're going to be punished. They're not going to have their own right to do what they want and live where they want. They're going into captivity. And that's when God says that I know the thoughts I have towards you. I know what I think about you. Thoughts of peace and not of evil. Even in driving them into a hard situation, he's saying, I'm doing this for your benefit. He takes the time to explain to them that even this hardship, I'm doing it because I care about you. And I have a plan here. There's a great purpose in this. And I'm just telling you, don't miss the times in the scripture where God takes a moment to say, this is why I've done something. Or I'm not just going to give you something, I'm not just going to tell you something, I'm going to even explain it to you. I'm going to explain it to you by showing you the opposite. Yes, you're on land, but that's water. Yes, you're in the light, but that's darkness. And he takes the time to explain it. I think this is really neat. This verse in Amos kind of really explains it. He says to the children of Israel, I will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be pulled out of their land, which I have given them, saith the Lord. This was when they were in the land, in the captivity. And he's saying, I'm going to plant them back. Constantly giving that hope and that reminder that I've still got you. I've still got a plan. I'm going to carry this through. And so God constantly explains and explains and explains. And it bothers me when I hear people talking about the Lord as if some God that doesn't ever explain anything and just do it because I said so. And there's just these hard rules that nothing gets explained. And that is so far from the truth of what God has. And so I think even in the order of creation, in the delicate care of how God lays out everything, we can see that God would say that I am a God of order and planning. I have good intentions for you. I'm putting this all together in such a way that you can have a fruitful life from beginning to end. So even in creation, we see this. It's all planned. You think of the opposite. You think of evolutionists that think of this idea of the Big Bang. Things just exploded and spun off and things happened because of the things spinning off and going and doing their own thing. And so random. And God would say, you're not random. I have planned your environment. I know what I'm doing in your life. Let him be God. Let him be God. All right, so let's keep going. Let's look at verse 14, and we want to get into day 4 of creation. So now we're going to sort of blast down through day 4, day 5, and day 6 of creation, okay? So day 4 of creation, in verse 14, it says, And God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And verse 15, And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And in verse 19, the evening and the morning were the fourth day. So I want to go back up to verse 14. It tells us that God said, let there be lights in the heavens, or in the firmament, to divide the day from the night. And he tells us why they're there. The word light that God uses in this verse, which we know he's describing the sun that's going to be created for the light, and the stars. We mentioned this last time, but the word light is the word ma'or. Ma'or. Many, many places in the scripture when we're referring to light in the Hebrew language, we're saying the word or. It's light. It just is light. This, when he's creating the sun, he calls it a ma'or, which is a light holder. So this begins to help us understand how there was light before the sun, because God himself is the light, and he chooses to give it to the sun and the stars, for that matter. He is light, and in him there is no darkness, and then he gives it to the sun. He gives part of what he is to the sun, just as he gives part of what he is to us, and we'll get to that later. So how was vegetation and everything else kicking around before the sun was created? No problem. They still had light. In fact, they had light from the original source. They didn't need the sun yet. God chose to use the sun to represent him, represent himself. And we'll get into this in other studies, but it goes so deep, because you think of how the sun and the moon and the stars represent the husband and the wife and the children. And you see that represented in Joseph's dreams. And you see it represented in Revelation 12 and other places. And so light, the light holder of the sun, now comes on the scene. So God bestows light to the sun. Just as in day one here, God, the creation of light, we need to know that God is the light and knowledge. Look at this verse from 2 Corinthians in the New Testament. It says, God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, that's the God we're reading about right now, right, in creation, he has shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Because God himself is the light. He chooses to represent that part of himself by using the sun. Isn't that cool? All right. So it also mentions in verse 14 here that he's giving the sun and the moon and the stars in heaven, and it says at the end of verse 14, he's giving them for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. So the heavenly bodies are used for time calculation. That's what they're for. Now, we know that, all calendars used to be based on 360-day calendars. We don't have that today. What's our calendars based on? 365 and a quarter, really. It's a Gregorian calendar. It's changed over the years. It was a Julian calendar. And before that, calendars were based on 360-day years. Why? Why was calendars based on a 360-day year? Let me ask you this. Why do we represent a year? Why do we call a year a year? A year does what? Or I think we might have done this one other time, but why do we measure something as a year? Because a year represents something. What is it? It's how long it takes the earth to go around the sun. So we call it a year. That's what God's saying here. He's putting the heavenly bodies in place so that we can order our days. So that's how we represent a year. Why do we all recognize a month? Same thing. It's from the heavens. Just like God says right here. It's how long it takes what? I'm going to get this wrong unless somebody helps me out. It's how long it takes the moon to go around the earth, right? Right. Somebody shake your head. Okay, I got it right. So that's a year. That's a month. I'm going to skip a week on purpose. Why do we represent a day? Why do we call a day 24 hours? Matthew. Exactly. It's how long the earth takes to rotate on its axis around one time. So all of the heavenly bodies are designed to give us time. We skipped one on purpose. Why does every culture on the face of the earth recognize a week? I expect there to be not much commotion on this one, because there is no reason. There is no reason other than God said so. God set it up this way. God created in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh day. And it then is used in every culture because of the way God created. There is no astronomical reason for every culture in this world to represent and recognize a week other than God set it up that way. You ever think about that? That's pretty fascinating. It's the way God established it. So here we have the heavenly bodies being used for us to tell time and to tell seasons. So notice that back on day 1 and day 2 before the sun, God said evening and the morning were the first day. God doesn't need the heavenly bodies to tell time. He can do that all by himself. They're there for us to be able to tell time. All right? So again, in verse 15 through 19, it begins to describe each of the heavenly bodies that God lays out. And it says that they are there for our benefit, for our telling of time, for our use of telling seasons. All right? So let's go on to verse 20. Verse 20, we're going to hit day 5 of creation. Day 5 and day 6, and then it's going to get interesting around verse 26. So verse 20 is day 5 of creation. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that hath life, and the fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales and every living creature that moves, with which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind." It's still here. "Every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good." In verse 22, God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth." And the evening and the morning were the 5th day. So we have fish and birds coming around, and everything being created after their kind. I think there's something interesting to point out here, that as we've been going through creation, we've been seeing God's delicate care, planning, involvement, order. We've gone from less complex creatures on earth to now we're getting into more complex. We started with plants, and now we're up to fish and birds, and we're going to get to the land animals and everything else soon. When we were reading about plants a moment ago, plants, it didn't say were blessed, but it says that the animals were. And I want you to notice this trend as we've been going through, that plants have a body, we'll call it. Body. Animals have a body and soul. I'll call it soul. Some say mind, some say heart, some say will. Okay, we'll call it a soul. So animals have a body and a soul. Humans, we're going to get to, are unique and different in that we have a body and a soul, meaning a mind, will, emotions, but we also have a spirit. A spirit. So as we've been going through and God's creating things on the earth, he's creating from less complex to more complex. And I tell you, this is going to come in to be really important in just a second, that God created plants with a body, animals with a body and a brain, and us with a body, a brain, and a spirit that is eternal and perfect, as it used to be. So let's go on to verse 24, and I want you to see day 6 of creation. Day 6 of creation of verse 24. God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creatures after his kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after his kind, and it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good." So again, everything after its kind is being created. Animals here not blessed by God in multiplying. Interesting. I take it for what it's worth. I don't know exactly what that means, but there's no blessing in the multiplying of the animals. Now let's go on to verse 26 and 27. We continue day 6 of creation, and we're going to see something unique. So chapter 1, verse 26. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." In verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. So man is now intentionally made to rule over all other life forms. Nothing else is given this commandment. Don't miss that. Man is created, and this is the first time that something is said, you will have dominion, control, power over something else. It's the first key to you being special, you being unique, is that God had us to have dominion. And I really think this is the other major question that comes out of this chapter. This is a question we all long to need to answer. Do we have any value? We have already looked at a God that is big and powerful and eternal and huge and powerful. And does he care for me? Yes. Yes, he does. He cares for me. That's pretty cool. That you can say, this big, eternal, powerful God cares for me. Well, maybe he cares for a plant too. But now we're going to ask the question, yeah, but do I have any value? What makes me different, special, unique, interesting? And there's something there. God created you different than the plants, than the stars, than the dogs. He made you very unique. And I think it's important not to miss this. We talked about that on the last slide, how it says in these verses that he created us in his image. We have an eternal spirit that sets us apart as different than the rest of anything that he's made. I want you to picture it this way. Picture it like software. Maybe you're a computer geek, maybe you're not, okay? But if you know computers, you know that you have some medium that you have your programs on, a floppy disk, or if you're old like me, or you have a hard drive or a thumb drive. What are the kids calling them these days? I don't know. Flash drive. I don't know. It's got to be some cooler term. Somebody give me a cool term for a hard drive. Flash drive. We'll go with flash drive. That's just the medium that it's in. But what is your program? What is your homework? It's in there. It's on there. If that flash drive is empty or full, it doesn't change the weight of it. It doesn't change anything. It's empty or full. It's the same. It doesn't change the weight, the mass. The neat thing about software is that it has no substance, but it's the real thing. That hard drive is going to look the same, smell the same, and everything else if it has your software on it or not. And that's like the real you. The real you is not your body. The real you is you, your spirit. This thing that God has created and put in you. And even there, it's not really in you, it is you. It's attributed to C.S. Lewis, but it's of questionable origin. It may have been somebody else who said it. But the quote is, you don't have a soul, you are a soul, and you have a body. And he's using soul as I would spirit. But it's the idea that people think of themselves as, this is me. This hand, that's me, and this hair is me, and that's going to fade away pretty quick. One of my favorite pastors, he says when he was a kid, he had this wave thing in front of him. He's like, now it's just beach. Just beach. So if you think of your hair as the real you got problems because it's going away. All right? Don't get too connected. This is just the shell to the hard drive. This isn't you. The real you is eternal. It's different from the animals. So that should help us not get too connected to our hair or anything else. Well, let's be good stewards of our hard drive. We don't want to bang it around too hard, right? Our tent, it's often called a tent. But let's remember that the real us is the Spirit inside of us. It's eternal. It's a question of where it's going to be. So the first part of this answer of do we have value? Yeah, God cares for me. But do I have a value? Yes, you do. You matter because you're created in God's image. Now, what does that mean, created in God's image? I think some people think that it means we're created to look like God. And I don't think we can say that because the Bible makes it pretty clear that God is a spirit and we should worship him in spirit and in truth. God the Father doesn't have a body. Okay, we think of God the Son as having taken on a body, right? Philippians, to use it, to be the perfect man. He emptied himself of some of his divine characteristics to become the perfect man. But we think of God as he describes himself as a spirit. So it has to carry a different meaning than just we physically look like God. This doesn't mean, it doesn't just mean, well, God has two eyes, so therefore we have two eyes. God has two arms, so therefore we have two arms. It means something more. In fact, I think God intentionally tries to get us to emphasize not on the physical. Isn't that part of the Ten Commandments? Don't make any idols. Because anything that we could physically make of God would show a limitation of what he really is. So I think that's one of the most important reasons why we need to understand that God is a spirit. When you try to put too many physical representations to God, all you're doing is limiting who he really is. And you're distorting what he truly is. So created in his image means that we are triune like him. We are triune. So we think of God as he's revealed to himself. We saw it earlier on in chapter 1 as let us make man in our image. Elohim is plural. It's not dual or two. It's not singular. It's plural. We know of God already revealing himself as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, even in the opening verses of this book, right? God creating, speaking the Word, the Son, and his Spirit hovering over the waters, the Trinity already being represented to us. And now we're made in his image. Father, Son, Holy Ghost, body, soul, and spirit. There we are. Created in his image. You ever thought about how everything God made is triune? What did he make? He made a universe, right? Single spoken sentence. Universe. Single spoken sentence. He made that one thing. And what is it? What is the universe? Space, time, and matter. That's what it is. And every one of those is triune. Space is three-dimensional space. Time is past, present, and future. Matter, solid, liquid, gas. And don't talk to me about plasma, or we can have that discussion, but not now. Okay, plasma is not a thing in this regard. Everything God made is triune. He's telling us, even in the creation, this is who I am, and I've made you triune like that. He didn't say that to the animals. He didn't create the animals that way. He didn't do it to the planets. He didn't do it to the animals. He did it to you. You are triune like he is. And let that sink in for just a minute. We have a spirit like none others. And what does this do? Being in the image of God, what does that give us that nothing else has been given? It gives us this eternal part. This spirit is eternal. It gives us self-determination. It gives us the ability to choose for ourselves what the future holds. And what value is choice without having a selection of choices? And then the great thing is, then God actually honors your choice and says you can go do what you want. It will have its own consequences, but you can do what you want with this self-determination. I've made you that way. I've made you in my image to be independent and free will. Have it. Go. But there are consequences for it. The neat thing about free will, and we're going to get into this in a couple of chapters too, one other time at a different angle, but the neat thing about free will is it's meaningless unless you have choices. And the ultimate choice to free will is to choose to love or not. Love is really the ultimate reality to choosing. Right? God is looking for people that would freely choose him. Some of us grew up in a family where you're like, you don't have a choice. This is what you're doing this, you're going to church, you're whatever. Okay? But at some point, it becomes your choice. Every decision in your life becomes your choice at some point. And when it comes to your relationship with God, God is waiting for that moment where you independently are the one to chooses him. A robot does no good. God doesn't, he could have made 1,000 of those and wouldn't have done anything. Because if there's no choice, there's no love. If you don't choose something, then you're not expressing love. If you have to do something, there's no love. And there's a word I want to put to this. Relationship. So the next time you hear somebody, dogging you about, do you have a relationship with God? Do you have a relationship with God? That's what it means when you're telling people constantly that you want them to have a relationship with God. What's the opposite? Let's set light from darkness for just a second, okay? Let's just lay it out there. What does it mean to have a relationship with God? What is the opposite of having a relationship with God? It means not having a choice. Either you have to worship him or you're not with him. That's the opposite of having a relationship, is having no choice. So to have a relationship implies I have chosen to know God and have knowledge of him and live with him and serve him and love him. That's what it means. That's the opportunity we've been given because we're created in his image. As much as you might think Fido in your backyard has a relationship with God, he doesn't have the capacity. You do. You have the opportunity to look at God and say, God, I choose you. I choose your path because you're made in his image. Yeah. Well, go to, we're going to do this. Go to Luke chapter 20. We're going to see if we can make one more point about that before we go on. Luke chapter 20, Jesus is on the scene. He's telling some stories. He gets challenged a lot. And so in Luke chapter 20, we'll pick it up in maybe verse 19. Luke 20, verse 19. The chief priests and the scribes the same hour sought to lay hands on him, that's Jesus, they feared the people, for they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. So he had already been speaking against the leaders, the religious leaders. And so they didn't want to just openly take the guy into prison because they feared that the people would revolt against them. So verse 20, they watched him, and they set forth spies which should feign themselves just men, just, running with the crowd. We're just regular people. We're not really here to ambush you. But they were. That they might take hold of his words, that so they might deliver him unto the power and authority of the governor. So they want to catch him saying something wrong so they can turn him into the law. In verse 21, they asked him, saying, Master, we know that you say, that what you say, what you teach is right, and you don't respect any man. You're unbiased. You're a good dude. But you teach the way of God truly. Talk about buttering him up. You know what the difference, talk about flattery. You know what the difference between gossip and flattery is? What are they doing? They're flattering him on purpose. I'll tell you the difference between gossip and flattery. Gossip is saying behind someone's back what you'd never say to their face. And flattery is saying to someone's face what you'd never say behind their back. And that's exactly what they're doing. Nothing but flattery. Oh, we know you're awesome. We just have this question for you. Verse 22. So, is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? Should we be paying our taxes to the Romans? Because we're Jews. They're trying to trap him. In verse 23, he perceived their craftiness, and he said to them, why tempt ye me? And I'm sure he said it like, why tempt you me? No. I think he had a little bit of indignation, righteous indignation. Verse 24, show me a penny. He's going to answer with an example. Show me a penny. Whose image and superscription is on this? And they said, well, it's Caesar's. And he said to them, then give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and give to God the things that are God's. what is the obvious next part of the conversation that is not recorded in the scripture? Okay, give to Caesar. Well, this is, okay, he's saying this is Caesar's. Okay, give that to Caesar. Okay. Well, give to God what belongs to God. Well, what belongs to God, Jesus? Whose image is on you? You told me whose image is on the coin. Whose image is on you? Oh, it's God's image. Okay, then render that to God. Because he made you in his image. So just as we render the material to God, we are made in his image. We are made with that kind of value and precision and care, and we're here to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice willingly to the God that loves us, just to choose to love him back. That's it. Is that your Christianity? I sure hope it is. Because that's all it is living a life of gratitude to a God who cares enough to orchestrate a good plan for your life. And that's the blessing of knowing God. That's the blessing of being made in his image. So, we asked, do we have value? Yeah, he cares for us. But do we have value? Yeah, we're made in his image. And God would say to us, yeah, you have value. I've given you an eternal spirit. Whether you're headed to heaven or headed to hell today, you have an eternal spirit. You're headed somewhere. And I've given you a spirit made in my image so that you can have this free will. You can determine your own destiny. Would you ever make something? I know people that make things, they make, robot war cars and different things, and they make stuff. Would you ever make something and then just say, oh, I've made you now, just go off and do whatever you want now? You don't have to stay here and do what I want you to do. You can just do whatever you want. That's really leaving yourself vulnerable, isn't it? I mean, can you imagine if you make, you're crafty and you make crafts, because some of us like to go deep in our crafts. And can you imagine making something and then just saying, I made you, but you can do whatever you want. Just feel free. If you want to leave the house, go ahead. But this is what God did. God made us and then say, I'm going to let you choose if you want to glorify me or if you want to go do something else. That is what it means to be made in his image. Just worship him for that. Let's finish off this chapter, huh? All right, verse 28. Let's finish it off. So God blessed them. This is the male and female. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Let's just touch on that right now, because the word literally means to fill the earth. It does not mean to refill. It doesn't mean to repopulate or to replenish. It simply means to fill. So don't let evolutionists tell you that there was an earth, it was destroyed, and now Adam and Eve are redoing it. It's not there in the language. We don't get into the language too often, but when we need to, we do. And the word for replenish, don't let that English throw you off. The word for replenish literally just means to fill. Go fill the earth. All right? So don't let the R-E in the King James throw you off. Does anybody have another translation other than King James on that? Or most of us have King James or something? Okay. So there's other English translations even that have fill. Go fill. So don't get tied up with that. Have dominion. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, in verse 28. Subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So we talked about filling it. Have dominion. Now verse 29. God said, behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is, which is on the face of the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat or for food. Verse 30. And to every beast of the earth, and every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, wherein there's life, I have given every green herb for meat or food. And it was so. And now it finishes, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Everything. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. He created everything in those 6 days. Everything seen and everything unseen. The angels, the earth, the stars, it was all done in 6 days, and it was good. Job chapter 38, Satan sang with all the angels at creation in his perfect state, and it was good. And then he had up to 120 years to go into corruption before his fall, and then Adam and Eve's fall later on. So it is important to note that people and animals are all vegetarians. They're all vegetarians. They're all in harmony with God and with each other until the flood. Until the flood comes. And that's going to be about 1,300 years later. The flood will change all of that. So in Genesis chapter 1, a couple of things we focused on is, and this was what we looked at in the first 10 verses, who is God? How does he describe himself? And he describes himself as the eternal Trinity. He begins to reveal who he is to us. And he tells us that he does care for us. He cares so much for us that he's personally involved with creation and with our lives. And he's provided an eyewitness account to tell us exactly how it all went down and how it's all going to go down in the future. And we've already gone through Revelation. And now today, as we look through the rest of Genesis chapter 1, we broach the idea, does God care for us? And through all of the intricate design and order that he's put into creation, we can see that it was all put here to set just the right environment for us. Louis Giglio, if you know that name, he's a pastor, and he describes how humans, this one group of humans on this one planet called Earth, in this huge universe, that's all here we are, all of us right here. And he says the best way to describe that is insignificant significance. That it's just us. And who are we? We're nothing. But yet we're so special that we're the apple of God's eye. Here we all are on planet Earth, this pale blue dot, and yet God cares about us. And all of this is put here to show his glory and to set the perfect environment for us. You could trust a God like that. He's got it all in order. He's got it all planned out. And yeah, he might care for us, but we also have value. He placed something in you that is unique, that he gave to nothing else. He gave you eternity in your heart. He gave you a free will to say, I choose to do what you want because you're right, you're good, you're loving. I challenge you, make that the cornerstone to your Christianity. Don't do anything unless you're doing it because you want to serve God. Now, I understand, when you're little, kids have to obey their parents, and that is right in the Lord. But there is a day coming for every child where every child has to say, everything in my Christianity I do because I want to serve you, because I love you, and not because you have to or anything else. Genesis chapter 1. So when we get into next week, when we get into Genesis chapter 2, it's more of the creation story. It's going to hone in on Adam and Eve. And I want you to see next week the detail that he puts into explaining this uniqueness. We just touched on it real quick at the end, that we are unique and that it's because we're made in the image of God. In chapter 2, we're going to get a detailed story of Adam and Eve, and we're going to look very much in depth at that idea of what exactly God put in you when he put his image into you. So stick around for that next time. All right, let's pray.